Okay, hi everybody. This is Daniel Korobkin speaking to you for WebYeshiva.org. We are studying Rabbi Saadia Gaon's Emunot Videot. It's been an interesting ride so far, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to start the third chapter of the first treatise of Emunot Videot, which deals with the topic of creation. Rabbi Saadia Gaon, in the first two chapters of the first treatise, has, to his satisfaction, proven that the world was created in time, that there is no such thing as an eternal universe, that there was a point where nothing existed and then something came into existence, that God is the creator, and that the creation was from complete nothingness. That's where we are so far. And we're going to look at chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a quite curious chapter in that Rabbi Saadia feels that in order to exhaustively bring forward his point using the logical argumentative process of the Kalamists of his time, he needs to also eliminate all the other possible theories or models of cosmogony, of the origins of the universe, that are not in accord with his own and are not in accord with the Torah's narrative of creation ex nihilo, of creation from nothing. So I'm going to share my screen with you at this point, and let's try and make sense of this. Chapter 3 is quite a lengthy chapter because Rabbi Saadia is going to be spending a lot of time going through 12 additional models for the origins of our world and setting about refuting them. I think I'm only going to be able to get through just 3 out of those 12 today. Just to share with you, I was debating with myself how I should approach this chapter. On the one hand, it's somewhat technical in its logical argumentation. And so I thought maybe I would just present very quickly these other 12 models and just quickly demonstrate how Reb Saadia is able to refute each one of the models. But I think in doing that, I would be doing a disservice to those who really want to try to get inside Reb Saadia's worldview and the way that he's thinking, even though it's quite foreign to us. It's not really the way that we would approach an issue using this kind of inductive reasoning of logical elimination of all other possibilities until we arrive at the true possibility. So once again, we have to this point verified through logical argumentation 3 basic principles that were presented by our prophets, meaning that this is the Torah view. And we presented these in the first 2 chapters, chapters 1 and chapter 2. So what is our view of creation? 1, that all things were at one point created anew. There has not been an eternal existence, as Aristotle had argued. 2, that existence did not create itself. That to us was, again, very, very strange, very foreign, very curious, why Reb Saadia would need to prove that, but we pointed out that there was this type of argumentation that needed to be eliminated. And 3, that the creation was ex nihilo, from absolute nothingness. We will now present 12 additional models of cosmogony which disagree with our view for a total of 13 theories. In the course of this presentation, says Reb Saadia, I will also provide the respective refutations of these models. I will also cite the verses from Tanakh that these models may wish to bring to support themselves, and will demonstrate that the verses are not in reality of support. So what this already tells us, even though we have to sort of reconstruct what Reb Saadia's thinking about this is that there were members of the Jewish community that also subscribed to these kinds of models. It wasn't just that he was speaking to Zoroastrians or having disputations with Kalamists. There were people within the Jewish community that may have subscribed to any one of these models, alternate models of creation, that Reb Saadia felt he needed to refute. And perhaps these different sectarian views may have brought psukim, verses from Tanakh itself, to support their view. So let's take a look at what he calls the second out of 13, which he calls the spiritual atomic model. Now, I want to remind you, and we studied this when we learned the Rambam's Moreh Nevuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed, that the Kalamists that Rabbi Saadia gets a lot of his ideas from were atomists. An atomist is a philosopher who believes that the universe is comprised of very, very tiny packets of material that have no essential traits to them. There's no color, there's no temperature, there's no level of dryness or moistness. They are just raw material without any form whatsoever. And God constructed these atoms to make up different components, different constructs of our physical universe. So this model goes even beyond that, and it says that these atoms that this particular school of thought subscribes to is of a spiritual essence, meaning that it has no material essence to it whatsoever. And this states that God created our universe, but not ex nihilo, but rather from eternally existent spiritual materials that formed the building blocks of our physical constructs. And the atomists call those atoms, and that's where we get the term atom in modern science, but they're two very, very different things. It's just that we use the word atom to describe current atomic theory or atomic physics, but not in any way. There was no, the view of the ancients when they talked about atoms is not in any way the view of what we view atoms as today. Now, the basis for this belief is that they assert that something can only be made from something else that exists, but not from nothing. And as we're going to see, the first theories or the first models that Reb Sadia puts down are predicated on the fact that the people who believed in these models could not get their head around the idea of a creation of something from nothing. Because our purview of experience tells us that anytime you want to construct something, you have to have raw materials. If you have no materials, you can create nothing. Nothing from nothing. Nothing comes from nothing. And something only comes from something else that is put together from that original something. And as a result, the other theories work around that. They avoid creatio ex nihilo because it does not compute. Okay? They believe that God collected very tiny, indivisible atomic units, finer than dust. He assembled them into a line and then cut that line in two. Now, here we're getting into some very, very specific, highly graphically described depictions of how God took these atoms, strung them along into one line. He then cut that line into two. He then took the two lines and crisscrossed them to make an X. He then attached those two lines at the X point, at the intersection point. He then cut the X into two smaller V's, using the upper V to create the outermost celestial sphere and the lower V to create the smaller internal spheres. Now, Reb Sadia is going through this very quickly. He's not explaining at all the rationale as to why the people believed in this specific kind of depiction. God also assembled these atoms into a cone-shaped structure to create a ring of fire above our atmosphere. He then assembled the atoms into an 8-sided sphere to create the layer of earth, then assembled a 12-sided sphere to create the layer of air, and then assembled a 20-sided sphere to create the layer of water bodies that we encounter in our frame of reality, which is our terrestrial realm. This, of course, is subscribing to the four-element theory of the ancients, that there are four elements and that there are layers of these four elements that surround our planet, the earth being the heaviest, and on top of that is water, on top of that is air, and above the atmosphere is a ring of fire that surrounds the air atmosphere. Now, this was all created according to these atomists from this crisscrossed X of these very, very tiny particles that are spiritual in nature, have no mass and no material structure whatsoever. They theorized this model because the multi-sided shapes they imagined all resemble these elements as they occur naturally. Here too, Rabbi Sadia doesn't give us any further explanation why Earth should be represented by an 8-sided sphere, why air should be represented by a 12-sided sphere, and why water should be represented by a 20-sided sphere. These things don't compute, they don't seem to make any logical sense, but we shouldn't expect to understand it because we don't have the original text from where Rabbi Sadia culls this idea from. He's just giving it to us in very, very brief form. So we'll take whatever we can. We'll say we just simply don't understand the logic behind this. And part of what Rabbi Sadia is going to argue is that so much of this theory is so arbitrary. So we're going to provide 12 refutations of this theory. That's pretty thorough. But he says, don't worry, we're not going to go through 12 different arguments now. We've already cited 8 out of those 12. In chapter 1, Rabbi Sadia says, I provided 4 proofs for the world being created in time. That this theory asserts that, in other words, the theory that we're currently working with is that there already was an eternal reality of atoms that was just transformed into the physical world we now experience. And so we've already proven that that could not have been, there cannot have been an infinite existence before our current existence. In chapter 2, I provided 4 proofs that creation was completely ex nihilo, that when God created the world, he didn't create it from something already existent, he created it from nothing. So I've already provided you with 8 out of the 12 proofs. So I will now provide an additional 4 refutations of this theory for a total of 12 arguments. So here are the 4 additional arguments. Number 1, their theory expects us to believe in spiritual particles that no one has ever seen or experienced. And it is illogical to simply accept this without evidence. That's argument number 1. Because remember, what is the motivation behind the people that put forth this model as an alternative to creatio ex nihilo? We've never seen something created out of nothing. Rabbi Sadia's argument is, well, for that matter, you've never seen spiritual particles being converted into physical particles. Number 2, these alleged atoms cannot possess any incidental qualities like heat, cold, dryness, moistness, color, number, etc., since this theory asserts that these atoms are not physical bodies, but rather purely spiritual ones. This makes this idea even more inconceivable. The whole reason they dismiss creatio ex nihilo is because of its inconceivability, but they exchange that model for something that is even more implausible or improbable. That's argument number 2. First of all, we've never seen these atoms. Number 2, to allege that they could possibly be converted from purely non-physical items to physical items, it also makes no sense. Number 3, I reject the notion that something that is completely non-physical and formless could be altered to material elements with physical characteristics. If you argue that God can do anything, then why not also argue that the same God can create from nothing? So, just to review, theory number 1, we've never seen these particles. Theory number 2 is that we've never seen anything that has no physical attributes at all. Argument number 3 is that how can you convert something that is completely non-physical and formless into something that is physical and has form? And finally, number 4, this elaborate theory with its cutting of the lines, its attachment of the 2 lines, its bisection of the X, etc., is completely without basis and is thus pure conjecture and fantasy. If God is so all-powerful as to be able to convert non-physical atoms to our present reality, why were all these steps necessary? God could have simply created everything from the atoms instantaneously. And if you argue that God isn't powerful enough to make the transformation in one step, how did he get the power to convert non-physical atoms into physical entities? There's going to be a lot of this kind of argumentation, what we call in the Gemara, mimon avshach. Choose your poison. Either way you look at it, you end up with a logical conundrum. So it makes no sense. So that's argument number 4 against this theory. Why couldn't God just use the atoms and instantaneously create physical reality? Why did he have to go through this elaborate process that these theorists have described of God assembling all of the atoms in a line, then cutting the line in half, then making an X, etc., etc., etc. The bottom line is that they came up with this theory to avoid a model from Scripture that describes something never before experienced, creation from nothing. But they ended up with something that is at least as problematic from that standpoint. Now Reb Sadia says, now hold on, this theory gained some traction in my time, even within the Jewish community. And so I've been told that some of our own people were swayed by this model, and they believed that they based their belief on a passage from Proverbs, that begins with Hashem Kanani Reshit Darko Kedem Mif'alav Me'az. This is from Proverbs chapter 8, beginning with verse 22. That now, if you look carefully at Proverbs chapter 8, as in so many chapters of the book of Mishlei, the book of Proverbs, you'll discover that the topic and the speaker of the verses is wisdom personified, because wisdom is the thing that King Solomon extols the most in the book of Proverbs. And really what the simple import of the verse is, God acquired me as the first thing of his way, meaning that the first thing that God manifested when he brought everything into existence was me, wisdom, chokhmah. Why? Because God's wisdom became manifest when he created the universe. But that's not how these theorists read the verse. They say that there was a two-pronged creation, that God first acquired the atoms, and it is the atoms that are speaking. We, the small, tiny particles, God acquired me, or us, as the first thing to use in order to bring everything into existence, and therefore we are called Reshit Darko. We are called the first path of God, the building blocks, the fundamental ingredients that were necessary to bring everything into existence, not Kriyatu ex nihilo. Now, they are mistaken in reading this verse in the way that they read it for 15 reasons. The first 12 reasons why they're mistaken is because I've given you already 12 arguments as to why it's impossible to subscribe to this atomist theory. Remember that the 8 that came from chapters 1 and chapter 2, that you must believe in creation from nothing, etc., plus the additional 4 reasons as to why the atomist theory in particular simply doesn't work. But now I have 3 additional reasons why you're reading these psukim wrong. The remaining 3 are based on a misinterpretation of this text based on the Hebrew. First of all, he says, 1, my first argument, the word Kanani means a creation from nothing, unlike their assertion that it means formation from a pre-existent substance. If you're saying that this verse is personifying the atoms, saying that God acquired me, I was an eternal substance, God took me and used me to create all of reality, that's not what the word Kanani means. I can demonstrate from other passages that have the same words, Kel Elyon Konei Shamayim Va'aretz, that Melchizedek turns to Abraham and he says, I hereby give you, enter into a pact with you in the name of the Lord of up high, who is Koneh, who acquires heaven and earth. You must submit that there, the word Koneh means is the creator of heaven and earth, because otherwise, if you're going to say that God is the one who acquires that which has eternally existed, heaven and earth, then you're stuck with saying that heaven and earth have eternally existed, which these atomists are not prepared to say. And furthermore, it says, Mal ha'aretz kinyanecha, the whole world is filled with your acquisitions, O God, as it says in the book of Psalms. That doesn't mean that the world is filled with some essential atom-like ingredient that has always existed. Once again, if you're going to read the verses that way, then you're going to be suggesting that the verses contradict the principle of Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So that's argument number 1. Argument number 2, Reshit Darko, also implies an initial creation from nothing. As it appears elsewhere, namely in the context of the largest of the animals that were created at the very beginning, at the time of creation, together with Adam, as it says in the book of Job, chapter 40, Hu Reshit Darchei Kel. This animal, these first animals that were created together with the first man, represent the Reshit, the beginning of the ways of God. And if you're going to be saying Reshit is a reference to the eternally existent atoms, then you're also going to have to submit that these animals that God allegedly created were not created at all, but have eternally existed. So that makes no sense from the Hebraic word Reshit. And number 3, if we continue in the passage of Proverbs, we discover that the speaker, namely Chokhmah, is a being or subject who loves truth and rejects falsehood. And that whoever loves this subject chooses life, Whoever spurns it chooses death, meaning that the speaker, the item that is being personified in these verses, is a speaker that people have the option to either latch themselves onto or to pull themselves away from. You can either latch yourself onto wisdom or pull yourself away from wisdom. If you latch onto wisdom, then you are pursuing truth and you are pursuing life. If you detach yourself from wisdom, then you are pursuing falsehood and you are pursuing death. These passages cannot be referring to the eternal spiritual atoms of this theory, since before their conversion to physical constructs, they would be devoid of attributes of things like truth or falsehood. And if they refer to these atoms after their construction to the physical, how could there be a possibility of them not attaining their intended status of truthful living, etc.? How could anyone say that you have a choice of either attaching yourself to these atoms or not attaching yourself to these atoms? It's absurd, because these atoms are the basic building blocks, the basic ingredients of all that exists. No one has an option of either being attached to these atoms or not. So that's why these three arguments basically shoot out of the water any possibility of finding scriptural support for this atomist theory, this atomist model of creation. Now, I've also been told that others found support for this theory from another passage, beginning with the words in Job chapter 28, from where can wisdom be found? And again, they take the word wisdom and they say that it's really a metaphor for these initial spiritual atoms. But this too is a gross misinterpretation. Firstly, it is clear that the subject is chokhmah, wisdom. How could they think that wisdom means atoms? And secondly, the passage states that this wisdom comes into existence simultaneously with the four elements, not its precedent, as is clear from the ensuing passages in Job. And therefore, he says, the meaning of both passages, concludes Reb Sadia, the one from Proverbs and the one from Job, is not a reference to these primordial atoms, but rather to wisdom. The idea conveyed is that God revealed his wisdom at the same time he created all of physical reality, because his wisdom was manifest in his creation. That's all the verses mean in the book of Mishlei. When we say that it was the wisdom is God's Reshit Darko, the first manifestation of his wisdom, it's referring to that when God created Bereshit, when God created all of initial creation, that was the first time that an observer outside of God could see God's wisdom be manifest in reality. Okay, and so Reb Sadia has exhausted argument number 2 out of 13. Number 1, it's completely illogical. Number 2, anyone who tries to bring support from Scripture is completely rejected. Now, theory number 3 of 13, that God created reality from a portion of himself. Now, this seems patently absurd for a number of reasons. God is indivisible because an infinite being cannot be divided, and so many other arguments. But there was an argument to be made, and in fact, it doesn't sound too different from certain Kabbalistic presentations of what our universe is comprised of. Everyone acknowledges this concept that is brought in Sefer Tanya and other holy writings, that every person is a chelek elokam imal, that we are really all just a portion of God. Every human soul, every neshama is a portion of God. And one way of viewing creation is that God withdraws himself and allows there to come to exist something that is really a part of him, but really separate from him. So it's very difficult for us to really even put into words how anything can exist outside of God. And perhaps this is what gave rise to this kind of argument, even in Rabbi Sadia's world, which predates the world of Kabbalah. But this theory or this model suggests that when God wanted to create all of our terrestrial and celestial reality, our universe, he took a portion of himself and spun that off into our current reality. Now, Reb Sadia is going to reject this, and it's important for us to see the steps that he takes. He certainly, because he's pre-Kabbalistic, does not use any kind of Kabbalistic language to reject this. So let's just see where he goes with this. He says, those who advance this model do so for the same reason as the previous one. They cannot deny the idea of a creator, but they also cannot conceive of a creation from absolute nothing. And so they basically say, since it's impossible to create something from nothing, we must conclude that if God had no ingredients to create the universe, he must have used himself to create current creation. These people, he says, are more foolish than the previous group. I will refute them in 13 ways, 8 of which I have already presented in the first 2 chapters, again, cited above when we refuted the previous theory. And I will now provide 5 additional refutations, since the 4 refutations of the previous theory, that it is impossible to have eternally existent atoms, does not apply to this theory. So we're going to give 5 different reasons why this theory cannot work. Number 1, it is inconceivable that a completely eternal being who has neither form nor quality nor dimension could even be capable of converting itself in part to a physical body possessing the aforementioned qualities. How could an infinite God without any attributes whatsoever spin off a portion of himself to have those kinds of attributes? That seems inconceivable. Number 2, it is inconceivable that a perfect and omniscient being would allow itself to be subject to imperfection, which includes loss of knowledge, pain, hunger, thirst, and other forms of privation that are uniquely germane to our existence. There would be no benefit whatsoever to the perfect God. Why in the world would God, and it's inconceivable that God would allow himself to be reduced in some way from his perfect, infinite being into, or at least to take a portion of himself and allow himself to be exposed to privation and flaw. Number 3, that's number 1, inconceivable, it just doesn't compute. Number 3, it would be unjust for the all-righteous God to subject himself to privation. No matter which side you take, it is problematic. Mimon nafshach. If the decision to make a part of himself imperfect was just, why would it be just for God to make a portion of himself imperfect? That implies that God is sort of punishing a portion of himself. That portion of God must have been guilty of something to deserve that kind of punishment, which is absurd. But if you argue that God's conversion of a portion of himself to imperfection is not a punishment, it's not based on anything that God did wrong, then where is the justice of the all-just God? It's an argument from a justice standpoint. We know that Hatzur Tamim Palo, that God is completely just and completely righteous. Why would a completely righteous God do something which is unrighteous? That is, to take a perfect being or a portion of a perfect being and subject it to suffering and privation. That seems to be unjust. Not only is it inconceivable from a logical standpoint to take something that is completely perfect and subject it to flaw, but it is not fair to do so as well. That's the third argument. Argument number 4, what was the motivation for that portion of God to convert itself to imperfection? Was it fear, or was it the hope of gaining something that God previously lacked? Either way, we're left with a conundrum. If the nature of God is to fear or to hope to gain, there is nothing other than God. So how can that be? How can God be fearful of something other than himself? How can God want to gain something if God is completely self-contained and there is nothing other than God? And if it was only that portion of God that converted to imperfection that possessed fear or hope, what caused that portion of God to spontaneously develop this fear or hope when the rest of God did not? This is all falsehood and folly. It's narishkeit, okay? And that's what he's arguing. And number 5, any wise being who has the ability to alleviate itself from pain would certainly do so. This being the case, creation should not at all exist, meaning that even if you're going to argue that God spun off a portion of himself to bring into existence this flawed reality, if you know you have some kind of disease in your arm, you're going to seek a cure for it. You're going to try to make sure that that disease does not persist. Why does God allow creation to persist if creation is a portion of God and it represents a flawed portion of God? Why wouldn't an all-wise being seek to alleviate itself from that inferior portion of itself by curing it? And therefore, creation should cease to exist and everything should return back to God. And if you argue that God, for some reason, requires created reality, then logic would dictate that the all-wise God would alleviate the pain of that portion that he initially spun off from himself, and then cure it, and then spin off another portion of himself into creation ad infinitum, since God is infinite in nature. This, too, is an absurdity and cannot be tolerated by the intellect, concludes Reb Sadia. Anyone who believes in the above in order to escape a belief in creatio ex nihilo is like someone who literally jumps from the frying pan into the fire. That's the analogy that he uses, or from rainfall into a waterfall. You're just making things worse for yourself. Furthermore, such a person is also rejecting our miracle-proven prophecies. You're going against the Tanakh depiction, the Torah's depiction of creation, which was from nothing. So why would you do that? Because it makes more sense to subscribe to this theory that God took a portion of himself and created the universe. That is sadly even more illogical than creatio ex nihilo. So you haven't gained anything. You've actually put yourself into a much worse position. And then we'll go into theory number 4 out of 13, which is a combination of the previous two models. And here's where Reb Sadia says, this model asserts that God created all of reality that exists today from both the eternally existent atoms that have no physical attributes, and he also took himself and created another portion of the universe. God created spiritual beings from himself, souls, angels, etc., and God created physical beings from the eternal primordial atoms. This model is subject to 17 refutations. He's not going to go through them because all you have to do is just do the math. You've got the first 12, which was the refutations, the first 8 refutations from chapters 1 and 2, that there could have been an eternal existence other than God, meaning that there is no such possibility of there being atoms that have eternally existed. You've got the additional 4 refutations of the first theory, that the atomist theory doesn't make any sense. And then you've got the additional 5. So you've got 8 plus 4 plus 5 that equals 17 refutations. The 5 refutations from this aforementioned theory of God creating the universe from himself. This model is therefore more foolish than the previous 2. Those who subscribe to this erred about God's omnipotence, thinking that he can do things like altering himself and all of the subsidiary results of such a folly. You know the famous question, can God create a rock that is too heavy for him to lift? That's essentially what this latter theory is suggesting, that God was capable of taking a portion of himself and making it imperfect in some way. And that's not something that Reb Sadia is prepared to entertain. It is the most basic of philosophical, illogical principles, and therefore it cannot be accepted. So we've rejected the atomist theory. We've rejected the theory or the model that God created our flawed reality of our universe from himself. And in my opinion, concludes Reb Sadia, it is much easier on the mind and more intellectually sound to accept God's ability to create ex nihilo, as well as the fact that it ends up being in sync with our prophetic tradition. Now, I felt that this would probably be of the right place for us to stop for today, because on page 58 of the Rosenblatt edition is where we're getting, it was the very bottom of page 58 is where that leaves us. And we're going to get started next time to go into the 5th theory, which again, Reb Sadia is going to spend a lot of time refuting. But that 5th theory is that of him who asserts the existence of 2 eternal creators. He's getting into a completely different mode of theory, that of the Zoroastrianisms and the Manichaeists, who were very much in vogue from the Persian world of his time, and that needs to be dealt with a separate treatment. So I think we're going to hold it here for today. Any questions or comments from anyone that's currently listening? If anyone would like to say anything, please feel free to speak up. If not, we'll hold it here for today. Just stop this. Anyone else? Okay. I wish you a good week. We will, Bezrat Hashem, continue this conversation soon. Take care.
Thank you, Rabbi.